Okay, well, welcome. Stephen Pickford, I've known you for probably about 20 years in different capacities. I met you working for the Treasury. It was a great privilege to work with you on things like Iraq, 9/11, and Turkey, all of which seem like tiny crises at the moment, but my viewers probably won't have met you. So can I ask you just to tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, my name's Stephen Pickford. I retired about 10 years ago from full-time work. I spent most of my career working as an economist in various government departments, most latterly in the Treasury. I spent a couple of periods working abroad, and my last job was as the finance deputy for G7, G20 meetings.
Right, so you were going to tell me, for the sake of students who won't have heard of this, as I hadn't before I joined the Treasury, what a G7 deputy is, and what you did as G7 deputy.
Okay, well, the G7 are a group of countries, the largest industrial countries in the world, and for 20 or 30 years they have met together. They have coordinated where they wanted to on economic policy matters. The meetings tended to be with finance ministers, in our case, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but they don't do the mundane work. The more mundane work and preparation for those meetings was done by civil servants working for each of them. We were the G7 finance deputies. And we prepared for their meetings. We drafted communiques. We tried to make the interactions between the ministers as smooth as possible.
Okay, so sorry, fire away.
And during the great financial crisis, I guess we spent a lot of time talking to each other. Between the deputies, we would hold teleconferences to discuss what on earth was going on. We'd try to warn each other when one of us was taking policy actions, so the rest were informed. And I guess our biggest task was to prepare for the what turned out to be the G20 summits in Washington and London in late 2008 and early 2009, which prepared a fairly comprehensive response to the crisis.
So you would be given a broad idea by someone like, would be Alistair Darling, wouldn't it? And you would have to work out and negotiate the details with your counterparts. For example, the global stimulus package of 2008 to 9 would have been that sort of thing.
That's correct. Yes, I mean an awful lot of work was done by all of our respective departments, but we would essentially be trying to get other countries onto the same page so that we could have a coordinated package to stimulate our economies, to try and redress the financial regulation problems that caused the crisis in the first instance, to get people to contribute to build up the IMF's war chest.
Okay. And my role in that sort of thing was to sit on the other side of the conference call, taking notes and checking that we got an accurate picture. For example, on the Turkey crisis, when I think you were probably still in Washington then, were you? But I remember you'd have been negotiating it on the UK's behalf.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Yes.
So that's a remarkable thing to have been the G7 deputy during the last huge crisis. And I wanted to ask you a few questions about that. So what was the biggest thing you learnt about economic policy making from being at the coalface in 2008?
Well, I guess two things, really. One is that every crisis is different, and knowing how to respond to the crisis is very much an art form rather than a science. You really don't know if what you're doing at a particular time is going to have the effects that you hope it will. So, for example, we were trying to fix the banking systems in our countries. We were trying to avoid a global depression by taking fiscal actions primarily. We tried to ensure that people didn't introduce protectionist measures, and we tried to make sure that the international financial institutions had enough firepower to help other countries that were getting into trouble. But we didn't really know whether we were doing too much, too little, whether it would work. I guess the second lesson is that in times like that, working internationally as a certainly cooperative manner, if not a coordinated manner, actually helps. Take fiscal expansion, for example. It was clear that we were going to have problems if we didn't have fiscal expansion, but standard theory would suggest that if you take measures like that, some of it leaks abroad. So everybody acting together reduces the effect of that. It increases the bang for your buck in your own country. It prevents markets from betting against you by stopping buying your debt, because everybody's doing the same. And it also helps to build up, and perhaps this is the most important lesson at the moment, it helps to build up a domestic constituency for taking these actions. If everybody else is doing it, it doesn't sound such a difficult thing or a silly thing for a country to do. And so international coordination, and be prepared to revise your plans if they're not working.
And the art of improvisation sounds quite important, because there's never direct precedent for what you're doing, is there?
Never.
And okay, so looking back on 2008, I was interested recently, I read Gordon Brown's autobiography, and he has a whole chapter on the 2008-9 stimulus package. It's obviously something he's very proud of as a government. So I guess you can feel equally proud given that you negotiated it. But looking back on 2008, do you think it was well managed by the international community? And what do you think worked best to avoid a depression?
We clearly made mistakes along the way. Perhaps one of the biggest mistakes was we took so long to recognize the depth of the problem. As you recall, it started off in a relatively small sector in one country. It was the subprime mortgage problems in America. That spread quite rapidly across pretty much all countries. The most advanced countries were the worst affected, because those were the markets that were typically affected. And it spread across all parts of the financial system. That basically the wholesale markets closed down. That took several months to reach a peak. Had we acted sooner, we probably would have done better. But I think once people realised how bad things were getting, and this was about September or October of 2007. The crisis probably had its origins in the spring to early summer of that year. I think then the response was reasonably good. In fact, very good. The central banks started by providing liquidity to make sure that the financial systems didn't completely clam up. We got a package of measures agreed to reform financial regulation. So to try to, you could say, close the stable door after the horse had bolted, but actually to try to make sure that things didn't get worse in the financial system. It then took another few months before countries were ready to come together with a big fiscal stimulus package, when it became obvious that the problems in the financial sector were having real effects on the real economy. But once that recognition was there, I think we acted pretty quickly. I think the fact that countries were dissuaded from taking protectionist measures, trade protection, as had happened in the 1930s. I think the combination of that plus ensuring that the IMF had enough money at its disposal works reasonably effectively in limiting the further spread of the crisis and in terms of preventing what was clearly a global recession descending into a depression.
It's been quite interesting looking with students at some graphs of that era, because if you show students a graph of unemployment, for example, for the last 40 years and ask them when the big crisis was, they'll point to the 1980s. They don't point to because the unemployment didn't rise as much as it so easily could have done. So I think that's right. I think that the biggest impact has got to be on public finances, hasn't it? Which I know we'll come on to in a minute. Okay, so on to coronavirus. Have we ever seen a crisis like this one before? And what do you think is the closest precedent?
Well, as I said, all crises are different. I mean, through my career, I've seen oil crises, emerging market crises, the Asian financial crisis, the breakup of the Soviet Union. They're all different. It's important to try and learn lessons from what happened in the past, but the read across is never exact. This is probably going to be the steepest fall in output we have ever seen. People are talking about activity now 20-30% below what it was 3 months ago. That's completely unprecedented. Are there crises that look like this? Not really, but the global financial crisis massive way.
Now, I just lost you there for a moment, Stephen. Yeah. So you were saying the global financial crisis is some sort of precedent. Just explain that again.
In the sense that in the global financial crisis, the effects spread very, very widely across the world and across industry. So compared to other crises that were either contained regionally or were concentrated on one particular sector of the economy, this one is just so widespread and so deep that it's difficult to underestimate the effect.
I mean, there's an irony about the fact that we've always talked about contagion as a financial phenomenon, whereas this is, of course, a disease that is contagious. Okay, so what aspect of this are you most concerned about?
Well, the fact that it is so pervasive, going across all countries, mean that unlike in the global financial crisis, when at least some of the emerging markets were still growing, this is affecting all countries. Everybody will be seeing a sharp drop in output. So there are no countervailing forces at work. It also is incredibly deep. The idea that I see that US unemployment claims are up to 30 million now. That's probably about 20% of the workforce, would be my guess. That's huge, absolutely huge. And the impact on the fiscal side of things will be equally huge. The idea that governments are paying most of the wages of many of the workers in the country is just completely unprecedented, in my opinion. The final thing I worry about is that at the moment, until and unless there's a solution on the health side, there's no obvious way out.
No, I haven't seen anyone suggest one. Okay, so is the current response from UK policymakers right? I mean, is it too little, too much, the right direction, the wrong direction?
Well, if you look at the UK, yeah, and I think that's true generally. I think the economic response has been broadly right. It's probably been a little bit slow. Just as on the health side, I think the economic response was probably a few weeks too slow. But I think the fact that they have acted in large quantities is the right thing. There's been a massive hit to both supply and demand in most of the countries. The companies, a lot of companies have just simply had to shut up shop. Left to their own devices, they would have laid off a lot of their workers. Those incomes would then not be available for people to spend. So both the supply and the demand side have seen huge impacts. In conventional demand terms, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, C was definitely very, very much affected. I definitely very much affected. And X has largely disappeared because there's no trade to speak of. There's only one thing left, which is G. Government spending had to rise. And I think the fact that most governments have come in with large amounts of support, be it income support or loan guarantees, is the right thing to do. Whether it proves to be enough, we will see. But at least they have acted with great strength and magnitude.
And I guess that leads to my next question, which is we've heard a lot recently about L-shaped or V-shaped or U-shaped recoveries. Which do you think it will be, and what will determine that?
I think it will largely determine how successful countries are at keeping a lid on the spread of the virus. I suspect that countries that acted quickly and were effective at containing the spread of the virus, will be able to ease their lockdown levels more quickly. South Korea, China, New Zealand, Australia, they've probably been the most successful at containing the spread of the virus. They should be able to return to some sort of normality quicker than other countries where the spread has taken a lot longer to keep under control. I guess that in some countries you will see a fairly sharp recovery. In other countries, and I'm afraid the UK is probably one of those, I think the recovery will be much more drawn out over time. It will take months, many months, I would have thought, before we start to get back to the sorts of levels of outputs that we saw before the crisis.
So it's an unusual economic crisis in that the main solution is medical and public health rather than anything financial.
I would have thought so. The economic and financial measures can mitigate the impact. Without those economic support measures, things would have been a lot worse. I'm sure the recession would have been much deeper. It would have had greater impacts on confidence, so that the recovery would have been even more delayed. But ultimately, I just don't think that things can get back to anything near normality until the health crisis has been addressed to a fairly large degree.
Yeah, I guess what we've been discussing in class at sort of A-level terms is that although there will be a significant impact on aggregate demand, what you don't want is a massive impact on productive potential from lots of bankruptcies, lots of scarring of unemployment, that sort of thing. So hopefully that's been averted, but we shall see. Do you think the UK has arrived at this crisis in good economic shape, or could we have been better prepared?
I think by and large the UK was in reasonable shape, with one proviso, which I'll come to in a minute. I think the UK had been reasonably successful at rebuilding the public finances after the global financial crisis, which was obviously a huge hit in terms of rising debt levels. And it's been a long slog to get to that position, but I think we probably got to the position where debt and deficit levels were largely under control. Also, the UK economy is relatively agile and able to shift resources. It's got a relatively flexible labour market. It's got a business climate that allows companies to respond fairly quickly. So the supply side is relatively efficient in the UK. My one proviso is that Brexit has been, at the very least, a distraction over the last few years, and I think it's still weighing on confidence. I think it will take companies longer than they would otherwise have taken to rebuild investment, for instance, because not only do they have the uncertainty of the pandemic, but also they don't know what the trading system will be like after the end of this year.
There's been surprisingly little discussion of how the trade talks are going, whether there might be an extension, which seems a very important point to clarify at some point. We shall see. Okay. Do you think there are any lessons we could learn from the past or from other countries about how to tackle this crisis? I mean, you've spoken eloquently about the public health and medical side. Is everyone doing much the same economically, or is anyone doing something interesting and innovative?
As far as I can tell, most people are doing much the same things to a greater or lesser degree. Most governments are providing some form of income support to people who would otherwise have lost their jobs. Most governments are taking some measures to provide support, mainly through loan guarantees to companies. Most countries are also doing that or concentrating on the fiscal side rather than monetary, although the central banks are being supportive where they can. But this isn't a crisis where monetary policy can do very much, in my opinion.
Well, there's very little room for manoeuvre anyway, isn't there?
I'm sorry?
There's very little room for manoeuvre, certainly on the interest rate side, is there?
That's right. There's no room for manoeuvre. Central banks are still doing more QE, quantitative easing, but I suspect that will have relatively little impact compared to the fiscal side. So I think most countries are doing the same sorts of things. I think where it varies is how aggressive they are being in terms of supporting, having counter recessionary measures in place. And I think, I guess one lesson I've taken from previous crises is that because you don't really know how much you should do, you should probably err on the side of doing too much rather than too little. You can always reverse the measures relatively quickly if you find that they're working too well.
Yes.
But it's very difficult to catch up if you start with very small steps.
Okay. Do you think now, I mean, public debt levels have to go up very significantly as a result of this? Is there any alternative to a couple of decades of austerity to pay back those debts?
Well, you're right. Deficits will be enormous. Debt levels will rise very quickly. The normal arithmetic applies. If you are adding to the debt stock, you will that in itself will have unpleasant effects, because you'll be paying interest on those debt stocks, which in turn will impact back on the deficit. You can get yourself into very nasty fiscal arithmetic. And if this crisis goes on for very long, the debt levels will go up enormously. The debt levels in the UK at the moment are about 50%. People are talking about them going to 100, 150% of GDP. That is considerably higher than we ever got to in the global financial crisis. And therefore, if you followed the normal paradigm, you would take that much longer to get back to sustainable levels. I mean, the normal paradigm, of course, is you get your deficit down. And there are only two ways of doing that. You cut expenditure or you raise taxes, or both.
Yes, well, the former being the more popular one recently, but I guess we might have to look at the second one as well.
I think you probably will have to, given the scale of the challenge. People are starting to talk about another way out. They are starting to ponder as to whether we've got the challenge is so large that people might start accepting that creditors are going to have to take some of the pain as well.
Well, but owners of public sector debt?
Absolutely. I mean, for example, somebody who used to work in the Treasury and then worked at the FT has come up with a suggestion that we should have, in effect, monetary financing of the deficit.
Okay.
Basically, the Bank of England has already said it's going to buy government debt directly, which the ECB, for example, has outlawed because it's regarded as highly inflationary. The Bank of England has said it's going to do so because of the unusual circumstances we're in. It's not unreasonable to, it's not out of the realms of possibility to say that the Bank of England should take a large chunk of government debt onto its books and not charge interest.
Okay, would you be worried about...
In effect, hold zero coupon perpetuals.
Okay, but presumably based on printing its own money to buy those?
Correct.
Okay, increasing the money supply and thus...
Would that be inflationary? I would argue not at the present time.
Right. Okay.
It's when you're in such a deep recession in terms of both supply and demand, there's no inflationary pressure at the moment. If it emerges, then maybe you can do something about it. But other governments throughout history have basically dealt with some of their debt crises by inflating them away.
Yes, with some side effects.
It is not a completely stupid idea.
Okay. Who was that was suggesting that? The Treasury?
That was a guy called Clive Crook.
Oh, right. So same surname.
He was right. Where was he writing? I saw it referred to in an FT article, and oh, that's right. He's now a commentator for Bloomberg.
Okay.
So you can find him on Bloomberg.
I'll look that one up. I thought for a minute you were talking about haircuts or partial defaults, but you were thinking more of the monetary side.
It could be. Yes. I mean, the fact is that the private sector creditors are going to have to start to take some of the pain as well. I mean, the fact that retailers are calling for rent holidays from commercial landlords, that's in effect a way of sharing the pain between the borrower and the lender.
Yeah.
So there are. I suspect that the fact that people are starting to talk about finding ways of mediating on contract disputes. Did you see a few days ago there was a legal panel basically suggesting that rather than everybody spending the next several years in court trying to negotiate or trying to reach a resolution on contract disputes, that there should be widespread resort to mediation. If you go down that route, then again, it's a burden sharing. It's a pain sharing solution. I think we're in quite radical territory, and I suspect we may well need some fairly radical solutions to this.
Interesting. Okay. You mentioned Europe earlier, and I was going to ask you, about the debt crises that we've recently seen in Southern Europe. Do you think those will be renewed? And do you think there's any danger to the integrity of the Eurozone from that sort of process?
The short answer is yes and yes. I think it's incredibly difficult to think that Italy and Spain, for instance, are going to find it easy to get out of this problem. They started with relatively poor public finance positions. Italy has now had a downgrade, so it's just one notch above junk bond status for its government bonds. So it will find it more difficult and more expensive to borrow on markets, but the scale of its problems mean that it's going to have to have a big fiscal stimulus in place for some time. So I suspect these countries will find it very difficult indeed. Will that cause problems for the Eurozone itself? Yes, because ultimately I've for a long time thought that the Eurozone is unsustainable unless you move further towards fiscal union. The northern countries are very opposed to that. You've seen already the response to the suggestion that there should be coronavirus bonds issued, which are basically a way of ensuring that all countries, whether irrespective of their fiscal position, can borrow at the same interest rate. The northern countries have rejected that. And that means that the potential relief that the southern countries can get from that route is closed. You see the politics in the EU and the Eurozone as getting more and more difficult. I think that the way in which the lack of solidarity shown within Europe is playing out means that the populist pressures that were already there in the southern countries are just going to get worse. Whether it results in any major disruption, I don't know. My guess is that the most likely outcome is, as always, that the EU and the Eurozone will muddle through. They'll find some way of giving support. The Commission have already come forward with proposals for some sort of solidarity fund, which will transfer some fiscal resources to the countries worst affected. But I don't think it solves the underlying structural problems in the Eurozone in particular. As you know, we had the Euro crisis 10 years ago, which was which had similar roots to it, which was a fiscal problem in some countries being solved by banks in the Eurozone as a whole being encouraged to lend to those countries. And then when those debts started to go sour, the banks themselves were under real pressure. They were facing insolvency, so they had to be bailed out by the richer countries. Yeah, I can see the same sort of problem playing out.
A lot of it will come down to the northern countries and their willingness to cross-subsidise the southern ones and their fiscal difficulties.
Precisely, that's what it all boils down to. Every big country, a big country like the UK or the US, basically does fiscal transfers across the regions and states of the country, and that's regarded as perfectly normal. There are no such mechanisms to any great degree in Europe.
They have to bargain each time.
You get there. I'm sorry?
There has to be a bargain each time rather than a sort of well-established process like the Barnett formula or something like that.
Precisely. Or the way in which state taxes are set out in the US.
Okay, Stephen, a final one for you then. In 50 years' time, how do you think we'll look back on this coronavirus crisis?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I'm tempted to say it depends on how successful we are at managing it. If it turns out that the downturn is very short, there's a very sharp recovery, and everybody can pat themselves on the back for having managed the situation brilliantly well, then people will look back on it and say it was an awful situation, but we managed it very well. It could be that the outcome is a lot worse than that. So the conventional wisdom is the Great Depression in the 30s was terrible because it lasted so long. So many people were out of work. So many people lost their livelihoods and their assets. The global financial crisis, on the other hand, was relatively mild by comparison. There was very little hit to unemployment, as you said. We recovered reasonably quickly. I think a lot of that is down to the way in which the responses were managed. In the first case, countries resorted to protectionism. They contracted their fiscal positions, and that was exactly the wrong thing to do. We shall see. I'm afraid.
Well, I was going to ask in particular about the threat to globalization. I mean, there must be one, and it must depend on how events come from here.
Yes, well, I think the pressures for a globalized response are there, but they're not being met. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that we have the administration in the US that we have, which basically doesn't seem to care anything about building an international response to the problem. Indeed, rather the reverse. Trump spends most of his time blaming other people and other countries for the problems that the US is facing. I think we're in a situation where, in the short term at any rate, for the rest of this year, there will be no globalized response. There is the risk of greater protectionism when we start to come out of this. We're already seeing that to some extent. And I think a lot will play on the presidential election at the end of this year.
Well, that I think is probably a good point to end our interview. Thank you ever so much, Stephen, for your wisdom there and for very interesting comments. And it was lovely.